This is kind of down my alley because it's about a motorcycle guy. My ex-husband had this annoying habit of bringing greasy old carburetors and things into the house to work on. So last week, when my friend called to tell me the story, my first response, where did this guy live? Now reassured that I was never related to him by marriage, this really is too hilarious not to share. The way my friend told it, this guy pushed his motorcycle from the patio into his living room where he began to clean the engine with some rags and a bowl of gasoline. When he finished it, he sat on the motorcycle and decided to start it to make sure everything was still okay. Unfortunately, the bike started in gear, crashed through the glass patio door with him still clinging to the handlebars. His wife had been working in the kitchen. She came running at the noise and found him crumpled on the patio, badly cut from the shards of broken glass. She called 911 and the paramedics transported the guy to the emergency room. So far, the story is humorous. That is what you get for being such a big lout to bring your motorcycle into the house kind of way. But here's where I really split a gut. Later that afternoon, after many stitches had pulled her husband back together, the wife brought him home and put him to bed. She cleaned up the mess in the living room and dumped the bowl of gasoline into the toilet. Shortly after her husband woke up, he lit a cigarette and went into the bathroom and sat down and tossed the cigarette into the toilet, which promptly exploded because the wife had not flushed the gasoline away. The explosion blew the man through the bathroom door. The wife heard the explosion and her husband's screams. She ran into the hall, found him lying on the floor with his trousers blown away and burns on his buttocks. Some of you are laughing, and it's a woman. The wife again ran to the phone and called for an ambulance. The same two paramedics were dispatched on the scene. They loaded the husband on the stretcher and began carrying him to the street. When one of them asked the wife, how did this injury occur? When she told them, they began laughing so hard, they dropped the stretcher and broke the guy's collarbone. So, I want to talk to you this morning, greater than my fear. So if you turn to Psalms 46, that's what we want to talk about. One of the most repeated phrases in the Bible is, do not fear, do not be afraid, or fear not. Why would this phrase appear so often and be one of the most regular subjects addressed from the Scriptures? Why? Because this battle with fear is something that every human being faces and must deal with in our own lives. Great men and women from the Scriptures heard this message from God about overcoming fear. Think about David. David was told, fear not. And when you think of courageous people in the Bible, you have to think of David. Moses, Mary, John, Peter had to face fear and make decisions in the midst of their own battles. Do you know what the two greatest phobias in America are? Public speaking and death. Those are the two biggest phobias in America. Do you know what the third greatest fear is? Dying while you're speaking publicly. John de La Fontaine, author of Aesop's Fables, once said, my life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which have never happened. Fear turns to worry, and worry leads our minds to begin to play the what-if game. Ever been there? What if? What if? And then we start doing all these mental gymnastics. And at some point, you just want to go, don't want to play the mental gymnastics anymore. And fear has that ability to initiate something in our mind that if we give it space and we continue to feed it, it will grow. It will expand. You'll find yourself worrying and being fearful about things that you never thought you could be. On the other side, if you choose to trust and not be fearful, then you start reaping that kind of a harvest of well. The perfect example of this was Y2K. Remember that episode? People literally thought the world was going to end. I mean, that the computers were going to shut down. None of us would know how much money we have in the bank. Missiles would go off, and you just go back to the hysteria of that. And it's laughable now, but it wasn't then. It's amazing. It's amazing, and really at the end of that, all of us woke up that morning after, and life was pretty much normal. I think there was one guy in Meeker that lost his PC, but there wasn't any major stuff that happened. The greatest weapon that the terrorists have are not the bombs that they carry around in their knapsacks or the planes that they can fly into buildings. The greatest weapon they have is fear. I mean, every time I stand in a airport line, I do not pray for the terrorist. I am just rather aggravated. And actually, when you start thinking about this, it promotes some kind of a prejudice. And it's all out of fear. And you know what happens? We look at somebody of a different color and we immediately begin to put our prejudices upon them when they're absolutely innocent. And it's fear. It's nothing but fear. Have no basis for it whatsoever, but that's the way we operate. We all have to make decisions, and we gather as many facts as possible and try to make the best choices from what we know. It would be nice if life were that simple. But when we have to enter into the fear factor, decisions become a little more complicated. No human being will ever live without fear, so the real question comes, what will we do in the face of fear? Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what do we do in the face of fear. All of us have fear in our life. Our choices usually center upon this. Shall I or shouldn't I? Whether it's jobs, relationships, finances, or any major decision, fear is associated with it. No way around it. Barry Glassner, in his book, The Culture of Fear, said, we are the most fearful culture in the history of man. And when you think about it, we have more security than any other generation that has lived on the planet before. I mean, even when it comes around to the medical field. I mean, I was watching a program one time and it said this, for every 7 years that you stay alive, your life expectancy grows by 1 year. And the reason why is because medical technology is having so many breakthroughs that they can detect things that are wrong with us earlier to prevent diseases from taking over and destroying us. Or how many cures we have today that we didn't used to have. And yet a lot of people spend a lot of their time worrying about something that may never happen in their life. Security when it comes to our finances, security when it comes to our nation, all these kind of things. I mean, we are a people that have a constitution of fear that really needs to be eradicated so that we can start making choices in our life without the fear absolutely dominating us. So what are your greatest fears? If I went around the room this morning and said, write down on that piece of paper in front of you, what are your greatest fears? Most of us could probably write something out. And then the question we have to ask ourselves is this: is God greater than that fear? And if He is, then how do I implement whatever it is so that I don't base my life around being channeled or directed by fear? And friends, if we don't learn how to deal with fear, fear will direct our lives. And that's as simple as it goes. I want you to read with me. I don't want you to read with me. I just want you to listen and read along. But from Psalms 46, David is writing here. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with the surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in an uproar. Kingdoms fall. He lifts His voice. The earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes war cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shield with fire. Be still. Notice this. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. If you have your outlines, you want to follow along, let's take a look at some of the ways to overcome fear. Number one is this: respond in faith, not in fear, concerning the future. I'm going to tell you a story here out of Numbers. And any of us that have been around the church very long know this story quite well, that there were 12 spies that were sent in to the Promised Land to bring back a report as to what it looked like in the Promised Land. 10 of them came back with a bad report. 2 of them came back with a good report. I want to read this to you out of Numbers 13:33. We saw that Nympha there, the descendants of Anak, came from Nympha. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. 12 spies went into the Promised Land. They all saw the same thing, but there was a division on how they responded. 10 responded in fear. 2 responded in faith. And friends, that is a category that every one of us here this morning look at when we see the future. We are either responding in faith or we are responding in fear. As many of you know, I was raised around athletics, and I loved the athletic world. I always wanted to be a coach. You know, I just loved that world. I loved the authority figure that coaches were in my life, and just the competition that went on. And my uncle was a wrestling and a football coach, and so I just ate it up around. And he taught me a lot about life. Sports teach you an awful lot about life. And I was a wrestler. I don't know why. When I look back on it, it was rather stupid. I mean, there was no future in it, but I loved it. I loved being around it. And in high school, and you'll understand why I tell the story. It's not in a bragging sort of way, but in high school, I lost 7 times in 7 matches. 4 times to the same guy. 4 times the same guy. I want to tell you why I lost him 4 times. His name is Dean Harrison. He's from Montrose, and I have a love-hate relationship with this guy still. Mostly hate. I wake up, sometimes in a cold sweat thinking, I could have beat this guy. I'd still like to beat him. 57 years old, you just don't do those kind of things anymore. So anyway, high school, we're walking in, and a friend of mine, Gary Stevens, had come from Olathe. And this was early on in the week, and we were going to have the wrestling match on a Friday night. And walking into the high school, I could take you to the very spot that this happened. I said, Gary, have you ever heard about Dean Harrison? He goes, oh, yeah. This guy is tough. He is an animal. And I melted. I mean, when you think about it, oftentimes what happens to us in the athletic world, the contest is decided before you ever get on the football field or the wrestling mat. And it's because you've heard the reputation of the opponent. I could never beat that guy. And it's because my heart melted within me. I already decided, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'll never beat him. Sure enough, that's exactly what happened. These guys did exactly the same thing. They go in. Now, when you think about God, it does, some of these giants that were in the land, some theologians think they were 9 feet tall. It doesn't matter if they were 20. It doesn't matter the size, because the one denominator in the equation is God. That is the most important one, and he says, it's your land. You can take it. But people, because they saw, and you know what's really interesting about this scripture here? Is that these guys come back with this report and says, we're like grasshoppers. And we know that we look like them in their eyes. How did they know? Because they never had a conversation with him. See, and fear multiplies in our minds and it makes something bigger than what it actually is. And if God says, I want you to take the land, then we ought to vote with God. Now, I hope this is true. I mean, most pastors, when they speak, they hope that what they're saying is true. And I've said this for a number of years. When sin occurs, there's nothing that an almighty God can do anything about it. When I choose to respond in fear rather than faith, I set a course for my life. Now, what the sad part about these 10 is that they not only set a course for their lives, but they prevented a whole generation from entering into the promised land because those people responded in fear just like the 10 did. And so you and I have to ask ourselves this particular question. How do we respond to what we see in the future? Are we taking our clues by what other people say about us? Or are we taking our clues from what God says about us? You know, I can almost guarantee you that there are people here saying about their future already, this is what's going to happen to me because that's what happened to my parents. I'm going to die at an early age because my mom got cancer. And yet, when we look at the scriptures, God says, I want you to know that I have a future and a hope for you. How are you going to respond? In faith or in fear? Number 2 is this. Know that God is in the storm with us. Listen to this in verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, our very present help in trouble. Now I want to relate a story to you out of Mark 4, and I wish you'd all go home and read it, but I know that you won't, so therefore I'll just tell you. Mark chapter 4 is a story about the disciples getting in the boat with Jesus, and they're going to cross the Sea of Galilee. And on their way to their destination, a storm breaks out, and Jesus falls asleep. There's 2 things I want to talk about that. How many times in our lives that when we start out with something, it is just great. We are just, here we go, and things are just wonderful. And then all of a sudden, without notice or without any kind of warning to us, a storm breaks out in our life and we go, what am I doing here? I mean, it's just those things appear in our lives and we recognize that there's those kind of points that all of us have to deal with. A storm just arises and we're right in the middle of it, and so we have to begin to deal with it. Second part I want to deal with is this. Jesus is fully God and yet he is fully man, and that is a mystery. Absolute mystery. And I don't think that it should ever be solved because there is something about a mystery that draws us. And there is something about this person, Jesus, that just draws us because he is both of those things. But I want you to notice this about his humanity. Number 1 is this. He got tired. He fell asleep. He had a full day of ministry. He was wiped out. He was tired. He got angry. He got irritated. And this is the one I really love. He got hungry.